All right, Chapter 7, the Jeffersonian Era. When we left off with Chapter 6, we said that the first 12 years of the new American government had been controlled by the Federalists, George Washington and John Adams. But in the election of 1800, we get a new American president in Thomas Jefferson. And he claims that this new era in American government will be a new revolution. In fact, he called it the Revolution of 1800. So in this chapter, we're going to look at Jefferson as president. In fact, that's our first major theme. We'll talk about Jefferson as president, and then we will follow that up with the second major engagement between the United States and Great Britain, and that is the War of 1812. So let's start off with this so-called Revolution of 1800. As we move into the new century, the Federalist Party is falling out of favor. We spoke about the Alien and Sedition Acts and how there was a backlash against them as a result of those laws, as a result of them throwing Republican newspaper editors in jail. So as we move into the year 1800, it's an election year and the Republicans are ready for power. There's just one hitch. As we learned with the first contested American election, they had not planned for political parties. That's how we ended up with a Federalist president and a Republican vice president, right? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Well, because of the election laws, each party arranged for one person to throw a vote away. So the person you wanted to become president got all the votes, and the person you wanted to become vice president got all the votes minus one. So he would come in second place, thus becoming the vice president. Well, the Republican ticket in 1800 was Thomas Jefferson for president and a man by the name of Aaron Burr for vice president. Jefferson would get all the votes for president. Aaron Burr would get all the votes minus one. Well, the Republican elector who was supposed to throw his vote away failed to do so. And as a result of that, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr got the same number of votes. They tied. Under the Constitution, if there is no clear majority for president, that is 50% plus one, if nobody gets a clear majority for president, it goes to the House of Representatives. So Jefferson and Burr tied, and the election goes to the House of Representatives. Now, there was a lot of speculation that Aaron Burr arranged for this to happen because he wanted to become president and he thought he could win in sort of a backdoor manner. But what ends up happening is the House of Representatives is controlled by the Federalists. And remember that the Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton. Now, they don't have a choice. They have to choose between Jefferson or Burr. So they can't choose the Federalist candidate to become president. They couldn't choose John Adams. They have to choose between the two Republicans. Now, Alexander Hamilton does not like Thomas Jefferson, but he hates Aaron Burr. He hates Aaron Burr with a passion. And so of the two men, he is much more willing to choose Jefferson, and that's exactly what happens. The House of Representatives choose Thomas Jefferson to become the third president, and there is this just adds fuel to the fire between Burr and Hamilton, and as a matter of fact, this will help to indirectly lead to Alexander Hamilton's death at the hands of Aaron Burr a little bit later, and we'll talk about that later. But Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States. And as the first Republican president, his goal was to dismantle the Federalist government. Remember that he did not approve of Hamilton's plan for power. He did not approve of this large, powerful central government. So he is going to do whatever he can to cut the size of government and cut the power of government. Now, Thomas Jefferson really plays a part. He was the sort of guy where if you went to visit him at the White House, which was allowed, you could just drop in and see the president if you wanted to. If you went to visit him at the White House, he would greet you in clothes that were maybe ripped or stained. He liked to play the part of the common man. He wanted to appear like he was a regular, everyday, average Joe, and that was not the case. Thomas Jefferson was a very wealthy plantation owner from Virginia. he founded the University of Virginia. He was an educated man. So he liked to play the part of this, everyday commoner, but in reality, he was a very shrewd and powerful politician. Now, as I mentioned, Jefferson was determined to reverse Hamilton's influence. And you can see here, in 1802, Congress abolished all internal taxes. He reduced spending of the American government, and he cut the debt in half. This debt that Hamilton had purposely tried to accumulate to try to tie the fate of government to wealthy people in the United States. Jefferson immediately sets out to reverse those actions. Now, even though he does cut spending, he does reduce the military, he is not a pacifist. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, we don't declare war, but we do all but declare war on a group of pirates operating off the coast of North Africa, known as the Barbary pirates. So he's not a pacifist. He's willing to use force when necessary. Now, the Republicans are firmly in control of the government. They control the executive branch because he is president, Thomas Jefferson is president. And eventually they will gain control of Congress, which only leaves the third branch of government for them to take over, and that is the judicial branch. And they want control of the judicial branch. They want complete control of the American government. And this is going to lead to a very famous court case in American history known as Marbury v. Madison. And this is a bit of a story, so just bear with me for a minute. The Republicans are in control of two of the three branches of government, the presidency and Congress. They want control of the third, the courts. However, as some of his last actions as president, John Adams appointed a number of Federalist judges. And according to legend, he was doing this right up until the last minute of his last night as president. These Federalist judges that he tried to appoint to the bench were known as the midnight appointments because he apparently went up to his last day as president. Well, he waited so long in signing these appointments that some of the new judges didn't receive their documents that officially made them judges. By the time those documents were supposed to be delivered, John Adams was already out of the presidency. Well, the new person in charge of delivering them, the Secretary of State James Madison, refused to do so because he was a Republican, and he didn't want to see all of these Federalists become judges. Well, one of the new judges sued to have Madison forced to deliver his commission, and there was a law. A few years earlier than this, Congress had passed a law saying that the Supreme Court could force public officials, such as James Madison, to deliver these sort of commissions if they wanted to do so. Well, the court case Marbury v. Madison, Marbury was the name of the judge that sued, James Madison. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the man pictured here, his name is John Marshall. John Marshall, we'll talk about him a little bit later. John Marshall was he was a Federalist, and he was a very strong nationalist. He believed in a strong central government. And this is what John Marshall said, John Marshall and the rest of the Supreme Court. John Marshall ruled that the law authorizing the court to force Madison to deliver the documents was unconstitutional. I'm going to say that again. John Marshall ruled that the law authorizing the court to force Madison to deliver these documents is unconstitutional. This is the first time in American history that the Supreme Court has declared a law unconstitutional. This is huge because if you read the Constitution, If you read the Constitution, it goes through each branch of the government, the presidency, Congress, and the Supreme Court, and it lists their power. There will be a presidency, and he has these powers. There will be a Congress, and it has these powers. When it gets to the part about the Supreme Court, it doesn't list any powers. The Constitution does not say that the Supreme Court has the power to declare laws unconstitutional. Now, we know that this was always the intent of the Founding Fathers because they included it in the Federalist Papers. But the Constitution does not say that the Supreme Court has the authority to declare laws unconstitutional. So, when it comes to this particular court case, it looks like on the face of it that the Republicans won because the midnight appointments did not go through and these Federalists do not become judges. But in doing so, the Supreme Court takes a major new power, the power to declare laws unconstitutional. That is known as the theory of judicial review. The theory of judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. It did that for the first time in the court case Marbury v. Madison. Okay. Back in Europe, Napoleon is in power in France. And if you don't know anything about Napoleon, after the French Revolution, France was messed up. It was crazy. They had killed their king. The government they had created was not strong enough to keep control, and that led to the rise of a dictator who later declared himself emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. And in doing so, he essentially went to war with the rest of Europe. And in fact, with the exception of Great Britain, he conquers pretty much all of Europe. So Napoleon is in power in France. He's an incredibly he is an ambitious individual. Like I said, he goes to war against Europe and beats most of them. And he wants to see France back in the New World. Remember that as a result of the 7 Years' War, France lost all of their colonies in the New World, and now Napoleon wants back in. And specifically, he wants land west of the Mississippi. Now, as a result of the 7 Years' War, that land had gone to Spain. But as it just so happens, Napoleon has an in with the King of Spain, who he placed on the throne of Spain. And so Spain and France sign a secret treaty, the Treaty of San Ildefonso, which grants France control of the land west of the Mississippi. Okay. The reason why this is important to the United States. New Orleans is a major port in the United States at that time. Farmers in the frontier relied on rivers to ship their goods to market. There are no roads. Roads that did exist are rough. They're difficult to maintain. It's very hard to ship goods across the land to get from the frontier back over to the more established cities on the Atlantic seaboard. So the way they did it was farmers grew their crops. They used the tributaries of the Mississippi River. They floated their goods down the river till they got to the Mississippi. Then they used the Mississippi like a superhighway. They flowed down to New Orleans, out through the Gulf of Mexico, and then back up the Atlantic seaboard. It was much quicker to do that than try to ship your goods across roads that were very, very poor. Well, what happened was, under the orders of Napoleon, Spain closes New Orleans to the United States. This is a major blow to the United States. This is going to cripple the United States economy. This is something that Jefferson has to address. Now, he doesn't want to go to war with France if he can avoid it, but he has to do something to get access to the port of New Orleans back. So what he does is he offers to buy New Orleans. He sends American diplomats over to Napoleon and he says, look, we have to have access to New Orleans. Let us buy the city from you. By this point in time, it has become open knowledge that France does, in fact, control land west of the Mississippi. So we're dealing directly with France. Now, as it so happens, by this point in time, Napoleon has other problems. He's losing the war in Europe. He's facing rebellions in Saint Domingue, which will eventually become known as Haiti. And so he says, you know what? I've got bigger fish to fry in Europe. Forget about New Orleans. You can have the whole thing. I will sell you the entire territory west of the Mississippi. And so the American ambassadors agreed to this, and they came back and they told Thomas Jefferson, not only does he want to sell us New Orleans, he wants to sell us the entire territory. And for his part, Jefferson wants to take it. Remember, Jefferson believes in westward expansion. He wants a nation of farmers. So the more land we have, the more land open to farming we have, Jefferson believes that is the best route to take for the United States. So Jefferson wants this land. But there's a very real question. Does he have the authority to agree to this? Remember that Jefferson is a fan of limited government, and nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president has the authority to expand, to purchase land on behalf of the United States. But in the end, he decided he did have the authority because the president does have the authority to make treaties. And technically, this is a treaty between the United States and France. So we bought the land, and the size of the United States doubles pretty much overnight. So we have added a huge chunk of land, including what is Arkansas. We add a huge chunk of land to the United States. He organizes an expedition, of course the famous Lewis and Clark expedition, to travel through the new territory and report back on what's going on. They actually exceed their charge because they travel all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Remember that the American Southwest, places like New Mexico, Arizona, California, that land is not included in the Louisiana Purchase. It is still property of Spain. So technically they trespass onto the property of Spain, but okay, fine. They travel throughout the lands. They meet a number of Native Americans, of course, their famous Native American guide, Sacagawea. And we begin colonizing this land. American settlers begin moving out west. Jefferson goes up for re-election in 1804, and he is re-elected easily. It becomes obvious that the public is approving of what's going on, that the people are happy with the job that he's doing as president. And of course, this means the Federalists are very unhappy because they've been pushed to the margins. They're nowhere near the force they once were. And in fact, nobody really knows how serious they were about this, but a small group of very disgruntled Federalists form what was known as the Essex Junto, and they actually talk about leaving the United States. And when I mean leaving, I mean seceding from the United States. They represent New England states, and they were talking seriously about trying to leave the United States, trying to secede, to break away from the United States. Now, it never goes anywhere. They're just a very small, sort of rogue element within the Federalist Party. A much more important event happens between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. A lot of Republicans felt that Aaron Burr tried to steal the presidency from Thomas Jefferson. Like I said, a lot of people believed he arranged for the guy to throw his vote away not to do so. So Aaron Burr has kind of been on the blacklist of the Republican Party for a long time now. So he knows he's never going to get anywhere within the Republican Party. So he's thinking about changing sides. He wants to become a Federalist. Well, he decides to run for governor of New York as a Federalist. And when Hamilton hears this, he can't believe it. And he immediately begins bad-mouthing Aaron Burr to anyone who will listen. And at least partially as a result of that, Aaron Burr loses the election to become governor of New York. And he is enraged. He is furious with Alexander Hamilton, and he challenges Hamilton to a duel. Now, duels were very popular at this time. Technically, they were illegal, but they're commonly used to settle disagreements between, quote-unquote gentlemen. Hamilton accepts this challenge, and as a result of this, on the day of the duel, from eyewitness accounts, Hamilton shot first, missed Burr. Burr took his time, aimed, shot, and killed Alexander Hamilton. So the leader of the Federalist Party is now dead, and Aaron Burr is a true outcast. The Republicans want nothing to do with him. The Federalists want nothing to do with him. He actually flees out to the West, where he spends most of the remainder of his life as an outcast. But Alexander Hamilton was the driving force behind the Federalist Party, and this is another huge blow to the Federalist Party of the United States. All right, let's talk about the upcoming war. In his second term, Jefferson is going to face two main obstacles. He's going to deal with fallout from these continuing Napoleonic wars between France and the rest of Europe. And he also has to deal with Native American matters back here in the United States. So let's talk about Napoleon first. Napoleon is engaged in war with the rest of Europe. Principally, by this point in time, the only power left standing against Napoleon is Great Britain. He's pretty much conquered the rest of Europe. So in order to combat Great Britain, Napoleon begins what is called the Continental System. Basically, what the Continental System said was, if you do business with France, you cannot do business with the English. If you do business with the English, you can't do business with the French. So it's economic warfare. Obviously, the rest of Europe is much bigger than just England was. So he's basically saying, if you want to do business with France, you can't do business with England. And nobody wants to give up doing business with the rest of Europe. So he's trying to get people to abandon Great Britain. Well, Great Britain comes back with what are known as the Orders in Council of 1807, which says essentially the same thing. If you want to do business with the British, who are still a major world power, they have a huge empire, they're a huge economic power. If you want to do business with us, you can't do business with them. Now, America claims to be neutral. And really, both France and England are violating our rights as a neutral, because as a neutral, we should be able to do business with whomever we please. And neither side should be able to tell us, if you do business with us, you can't do business with them. But of the two, we do dislike Great Britain more. Primarily because the British have the world's most powerful navy, and they claim the whole ocean. And they are still continuing this age-old practice of impressing American sailors, where they stop American boats, they look for runaway British sailors, and if they find them, they take them away. So for those reasons, because we encounter the British much more, since they have a bigger navy, a more powerful navy, since they are essentially kidnapping some American citizens, we have more problems with Great Britain than we do with the French. So Jefferson begins what he calls the Embargo, which basically says no American ships can leave port to go to a foreign country. The embargo, it prohibited American ships for leaving for foreign ports. This is a huge disaster. He's basically saying America is not going to do business with anyone overseas. We're not going to do any business with foreign countries, not just Great Britain and France, but we're not going to do any business with any foreign country. This is a huge blow to America's economy, especially in places like New England, which that is where most of the shipping companies reside, in places like Boston. So not only is this a huge blow to the American economy, it's a huge blow to the New England economy. And of course, New England is the seat of Federalist power. So as a result of this, the Federalists are going to see a surge in popularity. Now, in the election of 1808, the Republican Secretary of State, James Madison, is going to run for the presidency, and he's going to win. But the Federalists are now once again a force to be reckoned with. Thomas Jefferson horribly mismanaged the embargo. The American economy goes into a nosedive, and his choice as president does manage to succeed him, but the Federalists have gained a lot of power in the process. And even Jefferson knew that this was a huge disaster, and he does have to eventually back off the embargo. And we begin what's known as the Nonintercourse Act, which says that we can trade with anyone as long as it's not Great Britain and France. So it reopens trade with the rest of the world as long as it's not the English and the French, who are still violating our neutrality. And even then, eventually trade will be reopened with both of those countries as long as they agreed to respect America's neutrality. Well, France said, yes, we will stop the things that you are opposing. Great Britain did not. Great Britain would not respect American neutrality. And again, this is still relatively recent after the American Revolutionary War. Great Britain is still, they're still feeling the sting of losing the American Revolution. They have never really given us the credit we deserve. In fact, I don't think it's until Madison that they even actually send diplomats to the United States. They still don't recognize us as an independent country. So we've got lots of problems with Great Britain in the early 1800s, including Native Americans. In the early 1800s, a Native American by the name of Tinks-Wadawa will rise to power, and Tinks-Wadawa is more commonly known as the Prophet, and he was something of a religious leader. And the reason that he was known as the Prophet is because he prophesied a time where the white men were no longer in charge in North America. He was prophesizing a time where white men were gone and Native Americans were once again free to live as they pleased. This was a very popular message among Native Americans who were angry at the settlers for encroaching on their lands. And so the prophet became very, very popular. Now, the prophet's brother, his name was Tecumseh, and he began organizing these Native American followers into an army, essentially. And a lot of people were afraid that, a lot of Americans were afraid that Tecumseh and the prophet were about to lead a large-scale Native American rebellion against the United States. And remember that one of the major problems that the Native Americans had always faced is that they were not unified. And now it looks like they're getting over that problem because they have a set leadership. Well, and this all culminates in 1811 in the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which future president and current governor of the Indian Territory, William Henry Harrison, leads an attack against the Native Americans' base camp of Prophetstown. He attacks Prophetstown and essentially burns it to the ground. And the reason that Great Britain figures into this is because a lot of people accused Great Britain of giving aid to the Native Americans. They were instigating this. They were encouraging this. They were giving them supplies. They were giving them military advice. They were allowing them to use Canada as a military base. What would happen is Native Americans would gather in Canada, which still belonged to the Great British, so the American forces couldn't follow them into Canada. Native Americans would gather in Canada. They'd cross the border, launch a few raids against American towns, and then escape back into Canada. So a lot of people saw the British as aiding the Native Americans. And so America wants to go to war. They want to invade both Canada, which belongs to Great Britain, and Spanish Florida. Spain is an ally of Great Britain at this time. And so the North wants Canada, the South wants Florida. This seems to make a certain amount of sense. And in the election of 1812, we will see a number of men known as war hawks, men that were pushing to go to war, elected. Men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who are going to be giants on the American political scene, and they will essentially run the country for the next 40 or 50 years, these giants of American politics. And so we do. We go to war against Great Britain once again in 1812. And in some respects, America has lost its mind, right? Here we are. We're a young nation. We're barely solvent. We're struggling. A lot of people, we realize that we got lucky in winning the Revolutionary War. And here we are picking another fight with Great Britain. And the initial battles don't go that great for the United States. We try to invade Canada. We're thrown back. Tecumseh leads a devastating raid against Chicago, which is already emerging as a major city. Today we think of it as the Midwest, but back then the Northwest Territories. We do see more success on the Great Lakes, but all in all, the early days of the war don't go so hot for the United States. And then it gets even worse by the summer of 1814. By that point in time, the British have finished off Napoleon in Europe, and they can concentrate fully on the United States. So they began shipping in massive numbers of redcoats, the men that just beat down Napoleon in Europe. Now they can focus their attention on the United States. And these are seasoned troops. They're troops that have seen combat. And so the early days don't go well for the United States, and it gets even worse. Because in the summer of 1814, we suffer the indignity of losing our national capital. We had just begun work on Washington, D.C., and it's burned to the ground by the British. And so it does not look good for the United States. The one bright spot of the war is the Battle of New Orleans, in which Andrew Jackson essentially will become an American military hero overnight by leading a poorly trained, outnumbered force to a resounding victory over the British Redcoats. New Orleans, as I've already mentioned, was a incredibly important port. It was an important symbol for the United States. He was vastly outnumbered. You had the British troops. They were trained. They had the supplies. They had the equipment. And he's leading a force of slaves and militiamen and volunteers. And he wins a resounding victory over the British Redcoats. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the Battle of New Orleans doesn't really count for anything. As the war goes on, as wars tend to do, it became very, very unpopular. So by the time we get to the Battle of New Orleans, the peace treaty that ends the war, the Treaty of Ghent, has actually already been signed. So the Battle of New Orleans, in reality, had no effect on the outcome of the war. It was a great American victory, but it doesn't count for anything because we had already signed the peace treaty. Of course, there are no telephones or newspapers, overnight newspapers or anything. They had no idea the peace treaty had already been signed. So what is the end result of the War of 1812? Pretty much a draw. No one really won. It was kind of a stalemate. It kind of ended in a tie, except for the fact that ever since the War of 1812, the United States and Great Britain have enjoyed a very close relationship. They have been one of our largest trading partners through the years. They have been our most steadfast political and military ally through the years. So if anything, that is probably the largest, most important result from the War of 1812 is the fact that ever since then, the United States and Great Britain have been very good friends as nations.